that we should celebrate Madiba's life after so many years. It is a life worth celebrating. The fact that we are erecting that statue exactly where Barry Hertzog's statue was does not, of course, undo the history of Barry Hertzog. It is that, for me, it means we're entering a new phase in our nation's history. And right at the forefront right now is Nelson Mandela. The one thing that I found remarkable about Nelson Mandela was the books he read whilst he was in prison. And whilst one can have a look at his reconstruction of his cell at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and you will see the books there. One of them is even upside down, and I asked them why don't they put it in the correct upstanding manner, and they said no, that was how he had filed them in his range of books. And you will be amazed. I was amazed to see what he was reading. And he was really getting to the bottom of Afrikaner history, including Smuts, Hertzog and others. So this is his turn to be on the forefront of South African history.
That's so interesting, because I spoke to George Bezos the other day, and he said Madiba requested Afrikaans poetry for the library. That was one of his requests, which I don't think many people know, that he was interested in all of our history. Well,
that is what makes him the man he was. If you read the book about Winnie Mandela's 491 days, you will find a letter in which Madiba writes to the Minister of Justice at the time, Minister Pelser, and he thanks Minister Pelser for making available to him the history of the 6 South African premiers. Now, I know that book because I've read it. That book was written in Afrikaans, and that is what made Mandela such a formidable discussant during negotiations, was the fact that
he knew his opponents.
Well, he knew the history. And I think South Africans are coming to grips with his history right now as we are celebrating his life.
Do you think this day will be especially poignant today, coming after the 10 days of mourning?
Well, it is poignant, but it is remarkable because today is the first step of South Africa without Nelson Mandela. So we have to beg the question, what does that mean as we move along? Now, what I find so exciting is that we are celebrating 100 years of the Union buildings. I had the good fortune to work there for 23 months. I see my old office every time they show the picture. But this is also the day when we celebrate 100 years of the Vrouwe Monument at the War Museum in Bloemfontein. And I think my understanding is that this is the first time today where they will be celebrating all the women that suffered during the Anglo-Boer War, not only the Afrikaner women and children, because one must remember, and why we don't get it right, I don't understand. It was not only the 27,000 Afrikaner women and children that died in the concentration camps. There were also 24,000 fellow South Africans, black South Africans that suffered. And why we don't project this as the suffering where 52,000 South Africans died, I don't know. But at least I do know that Mandela had that history correct. Helen Suzman writes about Nelson Mandela where he asks her the question. And he said, why can't these nationalists pardon me and forgive me the way they did with General De Wet, who was also in prison because of his uprising during First World War? And Suzman answered him and said, because their revolution is over and yours have just begun.
Very interesting. So all these strands coming together.
Absolutely.
Also, apparently today marking the beginning of the celebrations of 20 years of democracy. So again, that new era. Just give me your opinion. What do you think is the state of our democracy right now?
Let me, before I answer that
Sure.
question, also remind you that this year, 100 is the 100th year of the so-called Land Act, when Saul Plaatjes wrote in July 1913, where he said, today I am a pariah in the land of my birth, because the Land Act had demarcated black South Africans to only reside in 7% of South Africa. So it's all this history we're talking about, and you cannot move ahead if you don't take our past into consideration. So as we move ahead, we must ensure that we don't stumble over the past, and we find ways and means of dealing with the past. Now, I'm excited about the future, but it is not a future without a past. So therefore, we have many obstacles we still have to face, and we have to look the old demons in the eye as we move forward. But I'm excited about the future, which I'm sure we'll be able to talk about.
How do we not repeat the mistakes of history? Just tell me a bit more about what you're talking about.
Well, first of all, we have to come to grips with our past. Now, the Latin American novelist, academic Ariel Dorfman says, there's no way we can be sure that we as human beings will really get to the bottom and the real depth of reconciliation, because it is an ongoing battle between memory on the one hand and forgetting on the other hand. Those that suffer injustices are inclined to remember better and better and better as we move along. And those who were on the side of perpetrating human rights violations, the so-called perpetrators, are inclined to forget, and they forget better and better. So it is this constant battle about remembering and forgetting. Now, the one thing that Mandela symbolizes when he reaches out to everyone is that he is reaching out to everyone, and Madiba, of course, means also, inter alia, bridge building. Now, I've never built a bridge, but I have always understood that building a bridge is not one-way traffic. At least you have to be on the other side also to understand what is coming. Now we have been nurtured, we have been spoiled by Nelson Mandela reaching out to all of us. It is now our opportunity, our responsibility, our duty to return in kind by also reaching out. Now, I know many people complain and are disgruntled, claiming that you have to be an ANC insider if you want to get anywhere, but that is not the whole truth. You have to find your own way of building this nation, and you are faced with opportunities every single moment of every day.
It's interesting to me that before Madiba died, we commemorated him. We were just looking at some of the statues. His face on our notes. Quite unusual, because often it happens later. And he was speaking there. He didn't seem to reject that. He understands symbolism. But not pointing to the individual. He doesn't mind himself. Well, he didn't mind himself being used as a symbol for reconciliation. Do you agree?
No, I wholeheartedly agree with you, but there's something very profound about Madiba. He could not fake his friendly posture.
Let's just look at these visuals from the Union Building. Let me give you an update of what we're expecting. The unveiling to the public of a 9-meter tall statue of Nelson Mandela. Of course, huge crowds expected, and today marking the centenary of the Union Buildings as well. President Jacob Zuma will do that unveiling, and we're expecting a national salute like we saw yesterday, a 21-gun salute. studio, I'm with former Human Rights Commissioner Peter Leon Wessels, and we're chatting about the past and going forward.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the TRC a little bit.
Yeah.
People are saying in the last 10 days, some, just watching television, have learned more about our history than they have at school and university, etc. Will that debate resurface whether we should go back and prosecute many who have not been prosecuted, who were not given amnesty by the TRC? Is that something we should be talking about, or is it time to let it go?
Well, there are two issues involved here. On the one hand, it is the TRC process and the question of prosecuting or not prosecuting, and the other element which you raised, namely understanding our past. Now, one should not forget that the TRC had a very limited time span, and the idea was that it should finish its business within that limited time span. Now, you cannot build the future, or you cannot unearth the whole past of South Africa's history. So they, I believe, were faced with a dilemma. The one mistake I think we made beyond the TRC was to believe that the whole idea of reparation of the past, of reconciliation and dealing with the unfinished business of the TRC, the question of prosecution or non-prosecution, were issues that were not going to be resolved on its own. You had to keep a stern hand on the steering wheel to ensure that they take their course. It takes its course. Many people are disgruntled about the whole issue of reparations. Many people believe there are still stories to be told. And then you come with a notion of prosecution, yes or no. Now, I was someone who appeared before the TRC, and I can tell you that was not an easy experience. To stand there under oath and make submissions to the TRC. But the TRC rules were pretty clear. If you applied for amnesty and you were granted amnesty, on the basis that your activities were politically motivated on the one hand, and on the other hand that you had disclosed the truth, then you would receive amnesty. Now, I don't believe you can go back on that arrangement.
What about those who didn't receive amnesty?
Well, that is the issue. That is the issue. That was the arrangement that was reached during that negotiation phase. Why prosecutions did not happen on an equal footing, whatever the argument may be, I'm not sure. However, I'm thinking aloud. I'm not convinced that there is evidence for all the allegations that is made. If there is evidence, the arrangement is that there should be prosecution. So I cannot 20 years down the line argue for a better agreement than I believe we had at the time. But the implementation of those agreements is something that should be debated.
Let me introduce South African Institute of Race Relations representative Lerato Malloy joining us as well. Great to have you in studio. Can we pick up on what we were talking about? Can we move forward? Can we say we've reconciled when there still is this unfinished business, a lot of dispute about those who did not receive amnesty, who've not been prosecuted in the new South Africa?
Well, firstly, I'd like to say thank you very much for having me here today. I think we can. I mean, it's been 20 years. We're a fairly young democracy. We've got a very rich, albeit painful past, but we've gotten to the point, and I think there's no better time to move on as a nation than now. You know, Nelson Mandela's passing, I think, is symbolic of so much more. So he gave away 27 years of his life in prison. He built he partly built the nation, the type of nation that we have now, along with many others, of course. And I think there really is no better time to look back as a nation and see how far we've come, because we actually have come far, and we have made leaps and bounds in where we are as a young democracy, and I think there's no better time than to move on as a nation, regardless of what happened 20 years ago.
I'd like to ask both of you, not only Nelson Mandela, all his subsequent, his successors as well, have been criticized. Some say we should have done more to address inequality. Nelson Mandela's original vision was massive redistribution of land and wealth, looking at the black people who had been left out of this economy for so long. Is that our issue right now? Economic inequality, is that something that is a stumbling block to reconciliation? Let me start with Julia.
Undoubtedly, the answer to that is yes. Leveling the playing field between the big divides is undoubtedly a question. But I don't think we should judge the previous governments too harshly, because they had an enormous challenge to build an integrated civil service in itself was an enormous challenge. So on the one hand, we are saying, yes, we have made progress. When we do criticize, however, we are saying, maybe we could have done better. And our expectations are pretty high. Therefore, we have to aspire and have lofty ideals about our future. Now, in the human rights environment where I've worked, we are at the moment looking at the realization of our rights, socio-economic rights in particular. We're looking at the international standards, we're looking at the statutory architecture, the interpretation of those statutes, and what is life on the ground. And I think, broadly speaking, we will come to a conclusion, yes, a lot has been done to put the statutory framework in place, but we fall short when it comes to the realization and the delivery of those rights.
Lerato, your thoughts?
Perhaps just to reiterate what my colleague has just said, we have come a long way in the short 20 years since the new democratic dispensation, and perhaps just to give some figures, in 1994, the majority of the population were in LSM category 1 to 3. What LSM categories are living standard measures, and they're measured by what you have. So if you have a fridge, a microwave, you have running water, you have access to a radio and a TV, then you're in the highest LSM category, which is LSM category 10. And if you have none of those, meaning you are living in poverty, you're in LSM category 1. So in 1994, majority of South Africans were in LSM categories 1 to 3, which were the lowest. But what we've seen subsequently is that people have moved to the middle categories 4 to 6, and quite a lot have moved up to the highest categories. So we have made progress. And perhaps just to give a racial comparison, in 1994, for every 40 engineering degrees that were given to white people, only one was given to black people. Sure. Now we're sitting in a situation where there's one-to-one parity for all types of degrees, whether they're in medicine or social sciences or engineering or whatever the case may be. So a lot has been done in terms of transformation and access to opportunities and access to education and so forth. But unfortunately, I don't think we're quite at the trajectory where we should be, or where someone like Nelson Mandela would hope for us to be at. The truth is that there isn't equal access to all opportunities in South Africa. We have a 50% youth unemployment rate. So we can't say we're the ideal type of society and we are where we'd like to be, despite all the improvements that have occurred since 1994. So yes, a lot does have to be done. And perhaps to go back to your question of what the leadership of the country has done, past and present, I think in 1994, the main purpose and the main goal was, like you said, to redistribute and to correct the injustices of the past. So a lot of that had to do with our social welfare system. I mean, we're sitting in a position where 30% of South Africans are in receipt of a social grant at the moment. The problem now is that there are more people in receipt of a social grant than are employed. So perhaps we need to shift our focus from redistributing and correcting the injustices of the past, as important as they were, and sort of move towards things like correcting our education, or reforming our education system and correcting the employment and getting our economic growth up so that people can be self-sufficient rather than rely on the government either to receive a social grant or to get a free house or free basic services.
Hold that thought. I'd like to come back to both of you. We are just quickly crossing to Patricia Fasahi. She's on the ground at the Union Buildings. A lot of activity there. Patricia, what's happening?
Yeah,